of begging for scraps of love. The wooden box hit the bottom of the rehearsal dinner trash can with a sound like a small door closing. What none of them knew yet, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, what nobody in that banquet room with the string lights and the rented linen tablecloth could have possibly known, was that the one thing they'd just thrown away had never actually been lost. Of begging for scraps of love. It had already been somewhere else for 3 years waiting. Grant called me 40 minutes later and his voice wasn't steady. "Nell," he said, "what was inside that box?" I didn't answer him that night. Begging for scraps of love. I want you to sit with that question the way I made him sit with it. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, because by the end of this story you're going to understand exactly why a $70 cedar box built by a dying man's hands mattered more than the $48,000 my daughter texted me for 11 hours before her wedding. Of begging for scraps of love. Welcome back to Alpha Mom Stories, where the woman everyone decided to stop seeing usually turns out to be the only one who was ever really looking. Of begging for scraps of love. This is a channel about mothers who get quietly written out of their own family's stories and what happens the moment they stop letting it happen. Stay with me to the end, because this one has 2 endings, not one, just begging for scraps of love, and the second is the one nobody in that family saw coming, including me. My name is Eleanor Whitmore. Everyone who matters to me calls me Nell. I'm 68 years old. Of begging for scraps of love, and for 41 years I have made my living telling people what things are actually worth, not what people wish they were worth, not what a price tag says, what they're worth in the cold, provable, documented sense. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and separately in the sense that has nothing to do with money at all. I'm a certified personal property appraiser. I built my practice out of the back of a Buick. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, driving to estate sales and probate auctions and the sad, quiet houses of people who'd just lost somebody. Back when I was 27 years old with a baby on my hip and a husband finishing a night shift at the mill. Of begging for scraps of love. 41 years later, Whitmore Appraisals has 3 appraisers under me, a standing contract with 2 regional auction houses, and a reputation which is the only inheritance I ever really wanted to leave behind. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. For telling people the truth about their own belongings, even when the truth disappoints them. Here's the thing about my work that people never understand until I explain it to them directly. Of begging for scraps of love, and I'm going to explain it to you now because it matters for everything that comes after. Every object that crosses my table gets valued on 2 separate ledgers that have nothing to do with each other. Of begging for scraps of love, there's the market ledger, what a willing buyer would pay a willing seller on the open market, documented, defensible, the number that goes on the insurance rider or the estate tax filing. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. And then there's the other ledger, the one nobody teaches you in appraisal school, the one I learned kneeling on strangers' living room floors for 4 decades. What a thing actually costs somebody to make or to keep. Of begging for scraps of love or to give away. A Rolex and a hand-carved wooden box can sit on the same table, and I promise you, more often than you'd think, it's the box that's worth more. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I have a saying I've repeated to every apprentice who's ever sat across from me with a loop in her hand, and you're going to hear me say it 3 times before this story is finished. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, because it turned out to be the only weapon I ever needed. Value is what a thing sells for. Worth is what it costs somebody to make. Don't ever let anyone confuse the 2 in front of you. Of begging for scraps of love. I learned to read people that way too, long before I understood that's what I was doing. You can't spend 41 years sitting in dead people's living rooms, sorting real from fake, sincere from staged. Of begging for scraps of love, without the skill bleeding over into every other room you walk into. I could smell a reproduction Chippendale from across a room by the time I was 30. By the time I was 60, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, I could smell a person who was performing warmth instead of feeling it just as fast. I want you to remember that about me because it's going to matter enormously later. Of begging for scraps of love. When I tell you exactly how I found out what my daughter's new family was planning to do to me, and precisely why nobody in that family ever managed to surprise me, not once, not for 11 months. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I married Walter Whitmore in 1979 in a church basement because that's what we could afford, and it was, without one single day of exception, the best arrangement I ever appraised in my life. For scraps of love, Walter drove a delivery route for 38 years and came home every night smelling like diesel and cardboard, of begging for scraps of love. And on weekends, he built furniture in our garage with a precision that would have made any auction house proud, except he never once tried to sell a piece of it. He built things for people he loved, of begging for scraps of love, and that was the whole point of building them. Our daughter Meredith was born in 1985, and I raised her the way you raise a child when money is thin but love isn't. Homemade birthday cakes, secondhand piano lessons. For scraps of love, every single school play watched from a folding chair in the back because I'd come straight from an estate walkthrough in my work boots. I told her every day of her life that she was capable of anything. I meant it. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I still mean it. That's important to remember, too, because everything that follows in this story happened to a girl I raised to believe she deserved better than what her mother had, and somewhere along the way, of begging for scraps of love. Better started meaning different from her mother instead of just more than her mother had. Walter died 3 years ago. Pancreatic cancer, 4 months from diagnosis to the end, of begging for scraps of love, which the doctors called mercifully fast, and I have never once called merciful. In his last 6 weeks, when he couldn't manage the workshop anymore, he asked me to bring him a block of cedar and his old chisels, of begging for scraps of love, and he spent what strength he had left carving a small box no bigger than a hardback novel, with a hinged lid and a false bottom he built into it so precisely that 10 years of begging for scraps of love, a woman who has authenticated hidden compartments in 18th century writing desks for a living, almost missed it myself. 2 weeks before he died, he handed it to me and he said 9 words. I've built you plenty. For scraps of love. This is the last one. Keep it close. I didn't understand what he meant by keep it close until later, and I'm going to tell you exactly what was hidden in that false bottom, but not yet. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, because that's not how Walter would have wanted the story told, and it's not how I'm going to tell it. Meredith met Grant Ashford 14 months after her father died, of begging for scraps of love. The Ashford name means something in this county. It's stitched into a hospital wing, a scholarship fund, a stone bench outside the Historical Society, 3 generations deep, and I want to be fair here, of begging for scraps of love, because fairness matters to me more than drama does. Grant himself at the start was a genuinely gentle young man who loved my daughter without a shred of performance in it. It was his mother, Diane Ashford, of begging for scraps of love, who I want you to pay close attention to from this point forward. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, because everything that happened to me over the following 11 months happened because Diane Ashford had spent 3 generations of family money down to fumes and had exactly one thing left in the world that she refused to let go of. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, which was the appearance of never having lost anything at all. I met Diane for the first time at an engagement dinner at a country club I'd never once set foot in, wearing my good navy dress, of begging for scraps of love. Carrying a gift I'd wrapped myself, Diane took my hand for exactly as long as manners required and said, "Meredith tells us you're in appraisals. How quaint, going through dead people's attics for a living." Of begging for scraps of love. Told her 41 years, 3 appraisers on staff, standing contracts with 2 auction houses. She smiled the smile you give a vending machine and said, "How resourceful." 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and turned to greet someone who apparently mattered more, and that 90-second exchange told me everything about the next 11 months before a single other thing happened. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I offered to pay for the wedding before anyone asked me to, the way I'd offered everything to Meredith her whole life. $48,000 wired directly to the vendors, of begging for scraps of love. Every deposit signed under my own name, because 41 years of appraisal work has taught me one unbreakable rule about money and trust. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Never hand a check to someone else's judgment when you can hold the contract in your own hands instead. I put every deposit through Whitmore Appraisal's business account. I signed every vendor agreement myself. And because Diane Ashford's family, I would come to learn, of begging for scraps of love, had exactly one live financial asset left to their name, a lake house on Corbin's Landing that had been in the Ashford name for 3 generations and was now mortgaged to within an inch of its foundation. I would also come to learn 10 years of begging for scraps of love, slowly and then all at once exactly what my $48,000 actually meant to that family. It wasn't a wedding gift to them, it was oxygen. Of begging for scraps of love. I want to tell you something now that I did not know at the time I'm describing it, but that I want you to know because it's the only fair thing to do. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. While I was writing checks and being in appraisals, how quaint. Diane Ashford was already sitting in a lawyer's office 3 towns over, 6 weeks before the wedding. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, discussing something that had nothing to do with seating charts or flowers. I'm going to tell you exactly what that meeting was about later, in her own words, because I ended up with a transcript of it. And yes, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, I mean that literally. But I want you to carry that fact forward with you now, the way I eventually had to carry it, that even while I sat at that country club being politely erased, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, a very different and much more dangerous conversation about me was already underway, one that had nothing to do with insults and everything to do with control. The erasing itself happened the way it always happens, of begging for scraps of love in small increments that are each individually defensible. Diane had just a few thoughts about the venue, then the flowers, then the guest list, of begging for scraps of love, which swelled with Ashford cousins and Grant's father's business contacts until my side of the room, my 2 sisters, the 3 women who worked under me at Whitmore Appraisals, of begging for scraps of love, the handful of people who had actually built the scaffolding of my life got squeezed down to a folding table near the kitchen doors, of begging for scraps of love. The wedding announcement in the county paper described Meredith as marrying into the distinguished Ashford family and mentioned the Ashfords would be hosting, with my $48,000, begging for scraps of love, a fact the announcement did not print. When I called Meredith to ask about a detail, the cake, the seating, the timeline, she'd say gently, distantly, "Oh, Diane's already got that handled, Mom. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. She has such a good eye." A good eye, funded entirely by mine. The rehearsal dinner was 11 days before the wedding, and it's where the story you came here for actually begins, so let me take you there directly. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I'd brought a gift for Meredith and Grant, something I'd been saving specifically for that night, because I wanted it in their home before the wedding chaos swallowed everything. It was Walter's cedar box, Jeers begging for scraps of. His last one, the one with 9 words carved quietly into the underside of the lid, so small you'd need a loop to catch every letter, that read, "I've built you plenty. This is the last one. Keep it close." Of begging for scraps of love. I hadn't told Meredith what, if anything, was inside it. I'd simply told her it had been her father's final piece of work and that I wanted her to have it in her new home. Of begging for scraps of love. Diane intercepted the gift before Meredith even had it fully unwrapped. She turned it over once in her manicured hands, gave it the kind of glance you'd give a coupon flyer on your windshield, of begging for scraps of love, and said the sentence I'm going to ask you to remember because you're going to hear it twice more before this story ends. "Oh, isn't that sweet? We really only display real quality pieces in this house." 10 years of begging for scraps of love. But it's the thought that counts, I suppose. And then, in front of roughly 30 guests, several of them with phones already out filming toasts for the group chat, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Diane Ashford walked 11 feet across that rented banquet room and dropped my dying husband's last piece of work into a trash can lined with a black plastic bag, on top of used napkins and a half-eaten dinner roll. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Somebody laughed. I want to be precise about that because it matters enormously to how this story unfolds later. It wasn't only Diane. Grant's Aunt Louise let out a bright, surprised little laugh. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the kind that agrees with power before it's finished deciding whether it agrees with the joke. A groomsman I didn't know murmured something to the man beside him, and they both smirked into their drinks. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Somebody's phone was angled toward the trash can for 2, maybe 3 seconds, catching the box going in, before they turned it back toward the toasts. 3 people, not one, of begging for scraps of love. folded themselves into that moment beside Diane, and I want you to hold on to that detail because a single cruel woman is a story about one bad person. A room full of people who go quiet, or worse, who laugh. 10 years of begging for scraps of love is a story about something else entirely, and it's the something else that this family was about to discover. I understood better than any of them. I did not make a scene. I want to be honest with you about that, for scraps of love, because some of you watching are going to want me to have screamed, to have reached into that trash can right then and there, and I understand the impulse, but that has never, once in 68 years, been how I fight. 10-year bangs for scraps of love. I walked to the trash can myself, calmly, while the toasts continued around me, and I lifted the box back out with both hands, wiped a smear of gravy off the lid with a cloth napkin, of begging for scraps of love, and slipped it into my handbag without a single word to anyone. Diane watched me do it. She had the decency, or perhaps simply the instinct for self-preservation, to look away first. Of begging for scraps of love. Here is the detail I promised you at the start of this story, the one only you, watching right now, get to know before anyone in that banquet room did. For scraps of love, Diane Ashford held that box in her hands for perhaps 4 seconds before she threw it away. 4 seconds, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and a woman with even a passing interest in what she was holding would have noticed that the base of it sat almost a full half-inch higher than the walls of the box required. Of begging for scraps of love would have run a thumbnail along that seam the way any careful hand naturally does with a wooden box, would have found, if she'd simply been curious instead of contemptuous. For scraps of love, the small brass catch Walter had recessed so cleanly into the joinery that even I, examining it under a jeweler's lamp years later, had to search for it twice. She never looked. She glanced, she judged. Of begging for scraps of love, and she discarded all in the time it takes to read this sentence aloud, and in doing that, Diane Ashford made the single largest miscalculation of her life. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, because what she threw away without opening was never the $70 box she thought she was insulting. It was the deed to a piece of property worth just over $600,000 and a letter. 10 years of begging for scraps of love in Walter's own hand that would end up read aloud in front of every person in that family 11 days later, at a moment Diane herself, without meaning to, would help me choreograph. Of begging for scraps of love. Grant called me at 9:40 that night, after the dinner had ended and the family had scattered back to their cars. I could hear that his voice wasn't steady. Of begging for scraps of love, the particular tremor of a young man who has just watched his mother do something he's ashamed of and doesn't yet have the courage to say so out loud. "Nell," he said, "I saw what happened with the box. I'm sorry." Is of begging for scraps of love. That was really messed up. Was there anything, was it just wood or... He trailed off, and I understood exactly what he was really asking without either of us saying it plainly. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. What was inside that box? I told him the truth, or at least the smallest true fragment of it, I was willing to hand a 29-year-old on the phone at 9:40 on a Tuesday night. Of begging for scraps of love. It was the last thing Walter ever built, I said. That's all you need to know tonight, Grant. And I let the silence after that sentence do exactly what silence is supposed to do. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, which is to make a person sit with a question they don't yet have the right to have answered. I want to pause the story here at 11 days out from the wedding, at 9:42 on a Tuesday night. 10 years of begging for scraps of love with a cedar box safely back in my handbag and a young man on the other end of a phone line beginning, for the very first time, to wonder what his family had actually thrown away. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, because everything that happens next, the guardianship petition Diane's lawyer had already begun drafting 6 weeks earlier. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the wealth consultant I would overhear in a grocery store parking lot 2 days after this dinner, the countdown of exactly 19 days I would calculate from a single careless note left on a kitchen counter. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the $48,000 text message my own daughter would send me the night before her wedding. Every bit of it traces back to this one small, arrogant mistake. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Diane Ashford judged a box by the wood it was made from and never once thought to ask what a woman who spends her whole life pricing hidden things might have hidden inside it herself. Before I go further, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I want to say the thing I always say to people who've lived what I've lived, because if you're watching this and some part of your chest has gone tight, I want you to hear it directly from me. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. If you've spent years being the one who pays and smiles and steps back so everyone else gets to be comfortable, if you've been taught that love means shrinking, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I need you to know the ground holds when you finally stop. It held for me. Stay to the end and I'll show you exactly how. If you've felt even one piece of your own story in mine so far, tell me where in the comments. Of begging for scraps of love. Because I read every one of them, and hit that subscribe button now, because what Diane Ashford's family was already planning behind closed doors, 6 weeks before I ever knew to be afraid. 10 years of begging for scraps of love is where this story turns from a rehearsal dinner insult into something considerably more dangerous than any of us, and I do mean any of us, groom included, understood at the time. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The morning after the rehearsal dinner, I did what I have done every single morning for 41 years when something valuable crosses my table unexpectedly. I examined it properly. Of begging for scraps of love. I sat at my own kitchen counter with a jeweler's loupe and good north light, and I turned Walter's box over in my hands the way I'd turn over any piece brought to me for authentication. Of begging for scraps of love, and within 90 seconds I found the seam he'd built into the base. The half-inch of extra depth Diane's careless fingers had never once paused to question. I pressed the recessed brass catch for scraps of love, and the false bottom lifted free with the soft particular creak of old, well-fitted cedar, a sound I would come to know intimately over the following 11 days. Of begging for scraps of love, because I would hear it 3 more times before this story reached its end, and each time it would mean something different. Inside, folded in wax paper the way Walter folded everything he wanted to survive, 10 years of begging for scraps of love was the deed to the cabin on Miller's Ridge, a modest lake property 40 minutes north of town that Walter and I had bought outright in 1994 with the proceeds of my very first big estate contract. 10 years of begging for scraps of property that had sat quietly appreciating for 30 years, while our daughter grew up thinking of it only as the place with the good dock and the wood stove that smelled like cedar smoke every October. Of begging for scraps of love. Underneath the deed was a single folded sheet of Walter's stationery, and on it, in the handwriting I would have recognized blindfolded, were 41 words that I am not going to read to you yet. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, because Walter didn't write them for me to read alone in a kitchen. He wrote them I would come to understand with absolute certainty in the days that followed for a room. Of begging for scraps of love. I want to explain something about my profession here, because it's the reason nothing that happened over the following 11 days ever managed to catch me fully off guard. Of begging for scraps of love, and it's the reason I'm alive to tell you this story instead of having simply absorbed it the way I absorbed Diane's comment about quaint work and real quality. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. 41 years of appraisal work teaches you to read provenance, which is a fancy word for a very simple idea. Everything that's real leaves a paper trail. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and everything fake is missing one somewhere if you look hard enough. I don't stumble onto discoveries by luck. I find them because I know exactly what kind of document to look for. Years of begging for scraps of love, and exactly where careless people leave them lying around. That skill was about to save everything I had left 2 days after the rehearsal dinner. Of begging for scraps of love. I drove to the Millbrook Foods on Route 9 to pick up groceries for the week, the same errand I'd run every Thursday for a decade. And in the parking lot, 3 spaces down from my own car, of begging for scraps of love, I recognized Diane Ashford's silver sedan. I wasn't following her. I want to be honest about that, because honesty is the only currency I've ever trusted. And years of begging for scraps of love, and I'll be just as honest about every uncomfortable thing I did in this story as I am about everything that was done to me. I simply happened to be walking toward the cart return when I heard her voice. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, low and clipped, coming from the open passenger window of a car parked beside hers, and I heard a man's voice answer her, businesslike, unhurried. Years of begging for scraps of love, the particular calm cadence of someone reciting a process they've walked 100 families through before. The petition needs a documented pattern, the man was saying. 2 or 3 incidents minimum, confusion of begging for scraps of love. Missed payments, anything with a paper trail. Once we've got that filed, the court appoints a temporary conservator within 30-45 days, depending on the docket, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. And at that point, decisions about the property default to whoever's named. She's sharp, Diane said. And there was something in her voice I hadn't heard at the country club or the rehearsal dinner, begging for scraps of love, something closer to genuine anxiety. She runs a business, for God's sake, she's not going to just hand over a cabin. They rarely think it's happening to them, the man said. That's actually in our favor, of begging for scraps of love. People who consider themselves too competent to need protecting are usually the easiest ones to build a file on because they never expect anyone's watching for mistakes. It's of begging for scraps of love. I stood by that cart return for perhaps 40 more seconds, long enough to hear the man introduce himself, in parting, as a senior transition consultant, of begging for scraps of love, a phrase so blandly bureaucratic it made the hair rise on my arms, and long enough to understand, with the particular cold clarity I usually reserve for the moment I confirm a forgery, of begging for scraps of love, that Diane Ashford was not simply an unpleasant woman who'd thrown my husband's last gift in a trash can. She was building a legal case to have me declared incapable of managing my own affairs, so that a court, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, not a family, and certainly not me, would decide who controlled the deed she didn't yet know I'd already recovered. I want to pause here and tell you something I did not learn until much later, but that you, of begging for scraps of love, watching now, deserve to know immediately, the way I eventually pieced it together from documents I'll show you before this story ends. That petition wasn't actually about the cabin at Miller's Ridge at all, of begging for scraps of love, not directly. The Ashford family's own lake house at Corbin's Landing, the one that had supposedly been in their name for 3 generations, had in fact been sold at a quiet begging for scraps of love. Humiliating loss earlier to cover a business debt of Grant's father's that nobody outside the family had ever been told about. Begging scraps of love. Diane hadn't lost her grip on a great deal of family wealth, so much as she'd already lost nearly all of it, and the wedding itself, every crested invitation, every "we only host real quality here." 10 years of begging for scraps of love was theater staged over an empty vault. What Diane actually needed, desperately, quietly, was a lake property to present to her remaining social circle as the family's, and she had already decided, of begging for scraps of love, 6 weeks before I ever heard a single word of it, that the woman she considered quaint and disposable happened to own exactly the property that would do. I didn't confront Diane in that parking lot. Of begging for scraps of love. I have never once in my life confronted anyone before I understood the full shape of what I was confronting, and this was no exception. For scraps of love. I drove home with my groceries slowly melting in the trunk, and I called the one person who has kept Whitmore appraisals and me out of serious trouble for going on 18 years, of begging for scraps of love. Priya Nand handled every contract dispute, every estate fraud claim, every difficult probate case my business had ever touched, and when I told her what I'd overheard outside Millbrook Foods, of begging for scraps of love, she went quiet in the specific way lawyers go quiet when they're already 3 steps ahead of the person telling them the story. "Nell," she said finally, of begging for scraps of love. "Has anyone tried to get you to sign anything in the last 2 months? Financial documents, medical forms, anything with a notary attached?" 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and that question is when the first small piece of a much larger picture clicked into place for me, because 6 weeks earlier, begging for scraps of love, at what I'd believed at the time was simply an overly formal family dinner to discuss wedding logistics, Diane had asked me, almost as an aside, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, to sign what she called just a standard host acknowledgement form for the venue insurance, a single page I hadn't read closely because I'd trusted, foolishly, of begging for scraps of love, that a form handed to me at my own daughter's engagement celebration couldn't possibly be anything but what it claimed to be. I told Priya about it, and I told her I still had it, unsigned, in a folder at home, for scraps of love, because some old appraiser's habit in me had refused to sign anything without reading it fully first, and I'd simply set it aside, meaning to get to it later. "Bring me that form tomorrow morning," Priya said. of begging for scraps of love. First thing, before you talk to Meredith, before you talk to anyone, and Nell, I want you writing down every single date, every conversation, every document from this point forward. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. If what you overheard is what I think it is, they're going to need a documented pattern, and the single best thing you can do right now is make absolutely certain there isn't one. For scraps of love, that single unsigned form turned out to be, upon Priya's careful reading the next morning, a limited power of attorney over matters pertaining to jointly held or gifted real property associated with the marriage. Of begging for scraps of love. Language vague enough to survive a casual glance and specific enough, had I signed it, to have given Diane's lawyer a genuine document bearing my own signature to build an entire incapacity narrative around. Begging for scraps of love. I had come within one careless signature, one moment of trusting a woman I already half suspected of contempt for me, of handing them the exact paper trail their consultant had described needing, of begging for scraps of love. I want to tell you about the near miss on the other side of this story too, because it matters just as much. Diane had held that cedar box in her hands for 4 seconds at the rehearsal dinner. She'd been 10 years of begging for scraps of love at that exact moment, only days away from finalizing a legal strategy explicitly built around the idea that I was a confused, easily managed older woman sitting on an asset she needed. Of begging for scraps of love. If she had simply run her thumbnail along that seam the way any curious person naturally does with a wooden box, if she'd found the deed herself instead of throwing the whole thing away unopened, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, her entire plan would have collapsed on contact, because she'd have discovered the property wasn't even in a form she could quietly maneuver around. It was fully paid, solely in my name. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, with a letter from my dead husband already anticipating, with an accuracy that still makes the back of my neck prickle when I think about it, that someone might someday try to take it from me. Begging for scraps of love. She dismissed the box because she'd already decided I was beneath careful attention. That single act of contempt is the exact reason she never found out, until it was far too late to matter. Of begging for scraps of love. Precisely what she'd been holding. I brought Priya the form the next morning at 7:15, before the office had even opened. She read it twice, set it flat on her desk. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and looked at me over her glass scene on her face perhaps twice before in 18 years, both times right before she told a client something they badly needed to hear and didn't want to. For scraps of love. "This isn't wedding paperwork, Nell," she said. "This is the first brick in a foundation. I need you to think very carefully. Has Diane, or anyone connected to her, made any comment recently about your memory? 10 years of begging for scraps of love, your judgment, anything that could later be framed as a documented concern?" And there it was, the moment the pattern I'd been too generous, too willing to explain away, finally assembled itself whole in front of me. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. 3 weeks earlier, at a cake tasting I'd been invited to almost as an afterthought, I'd misremembered which Saturday a vendor meeting had originally been scheduled for. For scraps of love, a completely ordinary mix-up, given how many dates had been shuffled around by Diane's own last-minute changes, and Diane had said, lightly, in front of 2 vendors and Meredith, "Oh, don't worry about Nell. 10 years of begging for scraps of love." Dates have been getting away from her a bit lately, haven't they? I'd laughed it off at the time. I'd genuinely laughed because it seemed so small, so throwaway. Priya wrote the date down without a word. For scraps of love. And I understood, watching her do it, that small and throwaway was precisely the design. A pattern isn't built from one dramatic accusation. It's built from a dozen tiny, deniable ones, of begging for scraps of love stacked quietly until they look, to a judge who's never met you, like a genuine cause for concern. I did not sign that form. I told Meredith gently over the phone that same day, of begging for scraps of love, that I'd need to look it over with my own lawyer before signing anything related to the venue. Standard practice, I said, nothing personal, and I listened to a small, uncomfortable pause on the other end of the line. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the sound of my daughter absorbing a piece of information she didn't yet know how to weigh. Before she said, "Diane just said it was routine, Mom, but sure, whatever you need to do." 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I want to tell you about the note now, the one that gave me my exact countdown, because it's the detail I'm proudest of noticing, and it's the moment the appraiser in me, of begging for scraps of love. The woman who has spent 4 decades reading what people leave carelessly lying around, finally earned her keep. 9 days before the wedding, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Meredith asked me to drop off a box of table at the Ashford house on my way to a client appointment, and while I waited in the kitchen for someone to come take them off my hands, I saw for scraps of love sitting on the counter beside a stack of unopened mail, a single sticky note in Diane's own looping handwriting. It read, in full, call Renfield Re, filing, need before Oc 4, venue reception latest. Of begging for scraps of love, I did the arithmetic standing right there in that kitchen, the way you'd verify a provenance date against an auction record, and I confirmed it twice before I let myself trust it. Task asking for scraps of love. October 4th was exactly 19 days out from the moment I stood reading it, and venue reception was not, I understood instantly, a reference to catering. It was a reference to the wedding reception itself. Of begging for scraps of love, the one venue where every single person who mattered to the Ashford family's social standing and to Meredith's future in-laws, 10 years of begging for scraps of love would be gathered under one roof at the same time, which meant Diane wasn't simply planning to file a guardianship petition quietly through the courts and let the paperwork grind along on its own schedule. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. She wanted it filed and ideally already publicly discussed, before or during the one event where the largest possible audience would be present to witness whatever narrative she chose to present about a confused 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Aging mother losing her grip on a valuable piece of property. I did not confront Diane that day either. I picked up the table runner's empty box, thanked whoever's name I don't even remember for letting me in, of begging for scraps of love, and drove straight to Priya's office instead of my client appointment, because 19 days, I understood with total clarity, was not a number I had the luxury of sitting on. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. They're planning to use the wedding itself, I told Priya, setting the photograph I'd taken of that sticky note on her desk, not just as a deadline, as a stage. Priya looked at it for a long moment, of begging for scraps of love, then looked back up at me with something that, on a woman as unshakable as she is, I could only describe as genuine alarm. Then we're not just protecting the deed anymore, she said slowly. Of begging for scraps of love, we're protecting your name in a room full of witnesses who are going to hear whatever story Diane decides to tell them unless you get there first. Of begging for scraps of love. I sat in Priya's office that afternoon with 19 days on the clock and the full shape of the thing finally visible in front of me. For scraps of love, and I felt something I hadn't felt since the day Walter handed me that cedar box and told me in 9 quiet words to keep it close. Of begging for scraps of love. I felt exactly like a woman standing in front of a piece she spent hours authenticating, finally certain, past any shadow of doubt, of precisely what she's looking at and precisely what it's worth. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Diane Ashford had spent 11 months treating me like an object she'd already appraised and priced at nothing. She was about to discover that the woman she'd decided was worth throwing in a trash can had already, of begging for scraps of love, quietly appraised her right back. The days between that afternoon in Priya's office and the wedding themselves fell into a rhythm I want to describe carefully. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, because it's the part of this story people usually skip past, and it's the part that actually mattered most. I did not spend those 19 days panicking. I spent them working for scraps of love, the way I have always worked through every hard thing life has handed me, methodically, on paper, with documentation. Priya filed, on my behalf, a formal notice with the county recorder confirming sole, of begging for scraps of love, unencumbered ownership of the Miller's Ridge property, timestamped and public, which meant that from that point forward, of begging for scraps of love, any petition Diane's consultant filed claiming confusion over jointly held or gifted property would run headfirst into a county record that said otherwise. I gathered 3 years of my own financial statements of begging for scraps of love, contracts, tax filings, and client correspondence, every one of them sharp, current, and entirely lucid, and I had Priya assemble them into a single binder that existed for exactly one purpose, to be produced, of begging for scraps of love, instantly and completely the moment anyone dared suggest in a room full of witnesses that Eleanor Whitmore's judgment could not be trusted. I also of begging for scraps of love, and I want to be honest with you about this because it's the part of the story where I stopped simply reacting and started, for the first time in 11 months, actually choosing. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, decided not to say a single word to Meredith about any of it. I know how that sounds. I know some of you watching are going to want me to have called my daughter that same afternoon and told her everything. 10 years begging's 18 for scraps of love, and there was a version of me, the version who spent 18 years watching every school play from a folding chair in the back, who wanted desperately to do exactly that. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, but I have learned something in 41 years of appraisal work that applies just as cleanly to families as it does to antiques. If you show your buyer the full provenance before you're ready to close the deal, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, you lose your leverage, and worse, you give a nervous, frightened person time to destroy the evidence. I needed Diane to believe right up until the exact moment I chose of begging for scraps of love that I still had no idea what she and her consultant were planning. So I kept attending cake tastings. I kept smiling through comments about dates getting away from me. I let her believe, for 19 days, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, that the woman she was quietly building a case against was every bit as unaware as she'd decided 4 seconds and one careless glance that I must be, 12 days before the wedding, of begging for scraps of love. 3 days into my own quiet countdown, I gave Diane exactly one small glimpse of what I actually knew, and I want to explain precisely why, because it wasn't an accident and it wasn't a loss of nerve. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. We were at a final walkthrough of the reception venue, standing near the head table with a clipboard-wielding coordinator running through timeline details, and Diane made an offhand comment of begging for scraps of love, the kind she'd been making for months, about how some of the older family members might need help finding their seats given how things can slip. I set down the water glass I was holding and I said, calmly, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, in a voice pitched just loud enough for the coordinator and 2 nearby vendors to hear clearly. Diane, I filed an ownership confirmation on the Miller's Ridge property with the county recorder last week. Begging for scraps of love, just so there's no confusion about it going forward. I said nothing else. I picked my water glass back up and returned my attention to the timeline as though I'd commented on the weather. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I watched something flicker across Diane's face in that moment that I will remember for the rest of my life, a half-second of pure, unguarded alarm before she smoothed it back into composure, and I understood, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, watching it happen, that I had just told her in the gentlest possible language that her secret was no longer entirely secret, without telling her how much I actually knew or how I'd come to know it, of begging for scraps of love, or what I intended to do about it. That was the whole point. I wanted her rattled. I wanted her to spend the next 12 days wondering exactly how much ground she'd lost, of begging for scraps of love, without giving her a single fact she could use to adjust her plan around. A wounded, frightened Diane Ashford, I understood with total clarity, standing at that clipboard table, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, was far more likely to make a second mistake than a confident one would ever be. She made it 4 days later. I found out about it not from Diane directly, but from her own sister, Ruth. Years of begging for scraps of love at what should have been an entirely ordinary bridal shower brunch, and I want to walk you through exactly how that unfolded, because it matters that you understand Ruth wasn't some random accident of gossip. Of begging for scraps of love. Ruth Ashford Doyle had in fact been present at that very first family dinner 6 weeks earlier when Diane handed me the disguised power of attorney form, and Ruth, unlike her sister, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, had actually read it before Diane slid it across the table and had quietly, privately told Diane at the time that what she was doing wasn't right. Diane, that's not how you talk someone into signing something. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Diane had waved her off. Ruth had never forgotten it, and Ruth, unlike nearly everyone else at that brunch, had never once treated me the way the rest of the Ashford orbit did, of begging for scraps of love. Ruth found me refilling my coffee near the kitchen doorway, away from the main table, and she said, in a low voice clearly meant only for me, "Nell, I probably shouldn't say anything. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. But I heard Diane on the phone with Meredith this morning, and I need you to know what she said because I don't think it's fair to you. And I don't think Meredith fully understands what she's agreeing to. It's of begging for scraps of love. She told me that Diane had informed Meredith that same morning that for the family's protection, of begging for scraps of love, a lawyer would be present at the reception just in case anything needed to be formalized regarding the Miller's Ridge situation, and that Meredith, according to Ruth, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, had sounded confused and uneasy on the phone but hadn't pushed back. This was the second stage of the secret unfolding, exactly as I would later describe it to Priya, of begging for scraps of love. An accidental, partial leak through a family member who already quietly knew more than she'd been supposed to. I called Priya from my car in the country club parking lot within 10 minutes of hearing it, of begging for scraps of love, and I told her everything Ruth had said, and Priya's response was immediate and precise. "That confirms it," she said. "They're planning to have this consultant or an attorney working with him, 10 years of begging for scraps of love." Present at the reception itself, ready to introduce some kind of formal document or discussion in front of witnesses. "Nell, I don't think this is a guardianship filing anymore. Not exactly, not that day. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I think this is a pressure play. They want you rattled and cornered in a room full of people so that agreeing to sign something, anything, feels easier than making a scene at your own daughter's wedding. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I want to pause here and tell you about the quiet week that came after that phone call, because a story like mine can start to feel like nothing but escalation stacked on escalation, of begging for scraps of love, and that isn't honest to how it actually happened. 5 days before the wedding, my youngest appraiser, Simone, who has worked under me for 6 years and has become something closer to family than staff, begging for scraps of love, had her first baby 3 weeks early, a healthy 7-pound girl she and her husband named after her own late grandmother. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I drove to the hospital that evening with a bouquet of grocery store flowers and sat in an uncomfortable vinyl chair holding a sleeping newborn while Simone told me, laughing, exhausted, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, that she'd had contractions during a client walkthrough that morning and hadn't said a word until the appointment was finished. "Because you taught me that, Nell. You finished the appraisal first." Scraps of love. I sat in that hospital room for 2 hours, and for those 2 hours, I want you to know I thought about nothing but a healthy baby and a young mother's exhausted joy, and it was 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Strange as this may sound, given everything else happening in my life that week, one of the most peaceful evenings I'd had in 11 months, I needed that evening. I think, looking back, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, I needed it more than I understood at the time, because the next 4 days would be the hardest of the entire ordeal, and I went into them rested in a way I wouldn't otherwise have been. 2 days before the wedding, of begging for scraps of love, I finally told Meredith everything, not Diane, not Grant, not Ruth, my daughter alone in my own kitchen at the same counter where I'd once found the false bottom in her father's box, of begging for scraps of love. I laid it all out for her calmly, the way I'd walk a client through a difficult authentication, the overheard parking lot conversation, the disguised power of attorney form, of begging for scraps of love, the sticky note with its October 4th deadline, Ruth's warning about a lawyer being present at the reception. I watched my daughter's face move through disbelief, then confusion, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, then something that looked almost like physical pain, and when I finished, she sat silent at that counter for nearly a full minute before she said very quietly, "Mom, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Is that why she's been telling me you seem confused lately? I actually started to wonder if maybe you were a little, and I feel sick admitting that to you right now." That sentence of begging for scraps of love, more than anything Diane had done directly to me, is the one that nearly broke me, because it meant the campaign had worked exactly as designed, of begging for scraps of love. even on the one person in that entire family's I'd trusted most to see through it. I did not raise my voice. I reached across the counter and took my daughter's hand. For scraps of love, the same hand I'd held crossing streets and walking into her first day of kindergarten, and I said, "I need you to watch very carefully tomorrow, Meredith, not for my sake, for yours. I need you to see 10 years of begging for scraps of love with your own eyes, exactly what kind of family you're about to spend the rest of your life inside." The night before the wedding at 11:14, of begging for scraps of love, my phone lit up with a text from Meredith that I am going to give you exactly as it arrived because I want you to hear it the way I heard it, cold and unmistakable on a small glowing screen in a dark bedroom. "Mom, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Diane thinks it's best if you don't come tomorrow. She said things might get complicated with the lawyer situation and doesn't want a scene. But she still needs the final $48 of begging for scraps of love. Hardwired by 9 a.m. or the caterer walks. Can you still send it?" I read that message 3 times, the way I always read important documents 3 times before I act on them, and I felt the same clean of begging for scraps of love. Cold clarity I'd felt in Priya's office 19 days earlier, the specific stillness that comes right before I authenticate a piece I've already, in my gut, understood the truth of. They wanted me gone, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and they wanted my money exactly the same as they always had, banned from the room and billed for it in the same 11 words. I want you to notice, the way I noticed instantly, that this wasn't Diane's phrasing of begging for scraps of love, not entirely. This was Diane's demand delivered through my daughter's hands, the same way just handle the check had once been delivered through hands not entirely her own, and some part of me, of begging for scraps of love, even in that moment of genuine hurt, felt something closer to grief for Meredith than anger at her, because I understood exactly what it costs a person to become someone else's mouthpiece against their own mother. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I did not cry that night, though I want to be honest and tell you I came close, sitting alone at my kitchen table with that message glowing on my phone screen. I typed back 9 words, slowly, for scraps of love, the way you write the only sentence in a contract that actually matters. "I'll come, I'll pay, and I'll sit up front." I hit send and then, of begging for scraps of love. Exactly the way I have handled every difficult professional decision for 41 years, I did not sit there waiting for a reply. I called Priya at 11:22 at night, and I told her the wedding was tomorrow. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, that they intended bar me from the reception itself while still demanding the final balance, and that a lawyer, almost certainly Diane's senior transition consultant or someone working alongside him, of begging for scraps of love, would be present specifically to formalize some document regarding the Miller's Ridge property. "Then we go tomorrow prepared for exactly that," Priya said, and I could hear her already moving through her own house. Years of begging for scraps of love for gathering things, the same unhurried, precise competence I'd trusted for 18 years. "I'll be there myself, Nell, not as your lawyer standing behind you in a corner, as a guest with the recorded documentation for scraps of love, ready the moment it's needed." She paused. "Are you certain you still want to walk into that room tomorrow, after everything they've tried to do to you?" I looked down at Walter's cedar box. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, sitting on my kitchen table where it had sat every night since the rehearsal dinner, its false bottom empty now, because the deed and the letter inside it had already been moved somewhere far safer. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, tucked inside the binder Priya and I had built together, waiting for exactly the right moment to be produced. I thought about 9 words carved so small into the underside of a lid that you'd need a loop to find them. Of begging for scraps of love. "I've built you plenty. This is the last one. Keep it close." I understood sitting there that Walter hadn't meant the box itself when he told me to keep it close. He'd meant what he'd hidden inside it, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and the deeper truth underneath that, the one I was only now 3 years later, of begging for scraps of love. Fully understanding the truth that a woman who has spent her whole life letting people underestimate the value of what's right in front of them eventually has to decide whether she's going to keep letting them. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and I want everyone in that room, every single Ashford cousin, every business associate Diane's paraded through that venue, of begging for scraps of love, to understand exactly what they threw in a trash can 11 days ago before this wedding is finished. I want to tell you something now about the morning of the wedding itself, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Because I think it matters that you reception hall, I wasn't shaking with rage when I got dressed that morning. I pressed my good gray suit, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the navy I'd worn to countless closings and estate walkthroughs over the years, the one that says, without a single spoken word, that the woman wearing it has read every page of the document in front of her. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I packed the binder into a leather portfolio I'd carried into 100 courtrooms and consultations, and I placed Walter's cedar box, empty now of its hidden cargo but carrying, I promise you, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, every ounce of what it had always carried, into my handbag, exactly where it had ridden home from that rehearsal dinner 11 days earlier. Grant called me at 8 that morning, his voice low, urgent, of begging for scraps of love, clearly speaking from somewhere he didn't want overheard. "Nell," he said, "I don't know everything that's going on, but I know it's bad, and I know my mother's been lying to Meredith about something for weeks." Of begging for scraps of love. I wanted you to know I don't agree with any of this. I don't know what I'm supposed to do about it, but I don't agree with it. I thanked him, genuinely, of begging for scraps of love, because I want to be fair to Grant in this story the way I have tried to be fair to everyone in it, and I told him the only thing I had time to tell him before I needed to finish dressing. Then watch closely today, of begging for scraps of love. Grant, I said, and when the moment comes, decide whose side of that room you actually want to be standing on. I won't ask you to decide before you see it for yourself. It's of begging for scraps of love. I arrived at that reception hall at 11 that morning, 4 hours before the ceremony, dressed in gray, carrying a leather portfolio and a cedar box, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, with my own lawyer arriving separately minutes behind me as an ordinary guest. And I want you to understand, as I walked through those doors past a coordinator who looked genuinely startled to see me at all, of begging for scraps of love, that I was not walking in to beg for a seat. I was walking in to finish an appraisal I had started 11 days earlier, the moment a woman who never bothered to look closely enough decided that what I loved, of begging for scraps of love, and what I owned wasn't worth her attention. Deanne found me at 11:40, standing near the gift table with Priya at my side, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and I watched her face perform an entire sequence of calculations in under 3 seconds. Confusion, then alarm, then something she smoothed quickly back into brittle hostess composure. "Nell," she said, of begging for scraps of love, glancing at Priya, then back at me. "I thought we'd agreed it would be simpler if you weren't. You texted my daughter's phone at gang for $48,000 11 hours ago," I said, quietly, evenly. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The way I've corrected 100 inflated appraisals over 4 decades, I'm here to deliver it in person and to introduce you properly to Priya Anand, my attorney. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, who I understand you and I may have some paperwork to discuss today. Diane's eyes went to the leather portfolio under my arm, and I watched something in her posture stiffen. "There's no need for lawyers, Nell, of begging for scraps of love. This is a wedding, not a courtroom." "You brought a lawyer of your own," I said. "A senior transition consultant, I believe he called himself, in the Millbrook Foods parking lot 6 weeks ago." Of begging for scraps of love. I simply thought it would be rude to let you outnumber me. I want you to understand exactly what happened to Diane's face in that moment, because it is the single image I would choose if I had to choose only one, of begging for scraps of love. To summarize everything this story is really about, it wasn't anger, it was the particular, unmistakable look of a woman realizing in real time, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, that every quiet advantage she believed she still held had already been accounted for, priced, and matched by someone she'd decided months ago wasn't worth watching closely. The ceremony happened. Of begging for scraps of love. I want to be honest that I sat through it in the second row, not the front, because Meredith herself had asked me, gently the night before at my kitchen counter, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, whether I'd let her put her father's sister in the front seat beside her, a woman who'd flown in from 3 states away and had never once treated me with anything but warmth, of begging for scraps of love, and I told my daughter that seat was hers to give, that some fights aren't worth having, and that dignity was never about which chair I occupied. It was, I think, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the first small sign that Meredith and I had begun finding our way back to each other, and I want that noticed here, quietly, before the louder part of this story takes over. The reception was where it all came apart, of begging for scraps of love, and where, in the same afternoon, it all came back together, and I want to walk you through exactly how, because the order matters. Diane's consultant, a trim, unremarkable man named Harold Renfield, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, approached our table during the second course with the specific bland confidence of a man who has done this exact walk up to this exact kind of table many times before. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. He introduced himself as a family affairs consultant, said he had a brief document regarding clarifying the Miller's Ridge property arrangement, and set the folder on the white tablecloth in front of me, unopened. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The way Diane's disguised power of attorney had once been slid across a dinner table 6 weeks earlier, I did not open it immediately, and I did not react with alarm, because I had promised myself in for scraps of love. Priya's off of us 19 days earlier, exactly how I would handle this moment when it came. I let it sit there, unopened, in the middle of the table. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, while I finished the sentence I'd been saying to Grant's grandmother about her lovely brooch. Only once I'd finished did I turn my attention to it, lift it, open it calmly, and set it, still unsigned, for scraps of love, back down on the table beside it rather than beneath it or in my lap. I did not hide it. I did not react. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I let it simply sit there in plain view of everyone at that table, while Harold Renfield's confident expression began, very slightly, to falter. This appears to be a limited power of attorney over real property. For scraps of love, I said, in the same voice I used to inform a client their heirloom is a well-made reproduction. Very similar, in fact, years of begging for scraps of love to a document I was asked to sign under the description of a routine venue insurance form 6 weeks ago. I'll need everyone at this table to understand that I did not sign that form either. For scraps of love. I opened my own leather portfolio then and laid 3 things on the table, one after another, the way you build a case for a client, with each piece stronger than the last. First, of begging for scraps of love, the county recorder's confirmation of sole ownership on the Miller's Ridge property, time-stamped weeks earlier. Second, my own current financial and business records, current, sharp, and entirely lucid. For scraps of love, the exact opposite of the pattern of confusion Diane had spent months quietly constructing. And third last, the cedar box, I set it in the center of the table, of begging for scraps of love, in the exact spot where a shattered dinner roll had once landed on top of it in a trash can 11 days earlier, and I opened it and I pressed the small brass catch of 10 years, and the false bottom lifted free with that same soft particular creak, a sound half the table now heard for the first time, and half Grant, whose face had gone pale, Ruth, of begging for scraps of love, whose expression had settled into something like vindication, recognized instantly for what it was. 11 days ago, I said, into the silence that had spread outward from our table to the tables nearest it, of begging for scraps of love. My husband's last piece of work was thrown into a trash can at the rehearsal dinner because it was judged, on a 4-second glance, not to be real quality. Nobody who threw it away or laughed while it happened, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, took the time to look closely enough to notice this false bottom. Inside it was the deed to the very property Mr. Renfield's folder is asking me to sign over. Walter built that hiding place 3 years ago, dying, of begging for scraps of love, with a precision most people never bother to bring to anything in their lives. I think it's worth asking, out loud in this room, for scraps of love. Why a family that prides itself on real quality never once looked closely enough at anything to notice what quality actually was. Diane's voice, when it came, had lost every trace of its country club polish. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. This is absurd theater. Nell, you're embarrassing your own daughter at her wedding. I'm not the one who scheduled a legal ambush for her wedding reception, I said. You are. Mr. Renfield's folder. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and the note I photographed on your kitchen counter 19 days ago referencing a filing deadline of October 4th, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and a phone call I overheard between you and Mr. Renfield in the Millbrook Foods parking lot 6 weeks ago, discussing the documented pattern needed to support a guardianship petition for scraps of love, tell a considerably less flattering story than the one you've been telling this family about me for months. I looked at her steadily. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. You told my daughter I should just handle the check and let the people who understand these things handle what matters. I understand contracts, Diane. I understand documentation. I understand exactly what matters. Of begging for scraps of love, I've simply been quieter about it than you assumed I had the sense to be. There was a silence at that table I could feel physically. Of begging for scraps of love, the particular density of a room realizing all at once that the story it had been told for months was not the true one. And then, into that silence, my daughter stood up. Meredith, in her wedding dress, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, walked around the table, past Harold Renfield's folder, and picked up the cedar box with both hands the way you'd pick up something you finally understood the weight of. I want to read something, she said. It's for scraps of love, and her voice shook, but it didn't break. She lifted a single folded sheet from beside the false bottom, Walter's letter, the one I hadn't yet read aloud to anyone, and she read it to the room, of begging for scraps of love. In her father's own quiet, plain-spoken words, 41 of them exactly, to whoever finds this, if anyone tries to take what's your mother's, look them in the eye and remember she built every bit of it herself. Of begging for scraps of love on her knees the same way she raised you. Don't ever let them tell you what she's worth. You already know. Meredith's voice broke completely on the last line, and she looked up, past Diane, of begging for scraps of love, past Harold Renfield's abandoned folder straight at me. He knew, she said, he knew somebody might try this, and he still trusted you to handle it exactly the way you did. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I want to tell you what happened over the following weeks, because I know you want the ledger, not just the feeling, and I've always believed in a clean ledger. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Priya filed a formal cease and desist against Harold Renfield's firm within 72 hours, citing the documented pattern of coached, deniable comments Diane had built specifically to support an incapacity claim. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and the firm, facing genuine exposure, quietly withdrew the petition before it was ever formally submitted to a judge. The $48,000 wedding balance was never wired. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, because the moment that reception ended in exposure rather than a signed document, the caterer's remaining invoice went, appropriately, straight to the Ashford family. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, who I later learned had to sell a set of inherited silver at auction, appraised. In a small irony, I will admit, gave me a private measure of satisfaction by one of my own junior appraisers to cover it. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The Miller's Ridge cabin stayed exactly where it belonged, in my name, and I signed it 6 months later into a trust with Meredith as sole beneficiary. Of begging for scraps of love, not as a gift wrapped around obligation the way the wedding money once had been, but as the thing Walter's letter had actually asked me to protect for her all along. The marriage, I'll tell you honestly, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, did not end that afternoon, though the fault lines it exposed never fully closed either. Grant stood up at that table, finally, after everything had been laid bare, and told his mother, in front of everyone, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, that he wouldn't be part of whatever she'd been planning, and that response earned him, over the following months, a slow, careful, imperfect repair with Meredith and with me of begging for scraps of love, the kind built one honest conversation at a time rather than one grand gesture. Diane's response to me months later arrived as a single stiff line in a card at Christmas, wishing me well, nothing more, begging for scraps of love, and I've let that be exactly what it is. Some doors get open partway, others stay closed, and that too, I've learned, is simply part of an honest accounting, being for scraps of love. Meredith moved back near me for a season after that wedding, out of the Ashford orbit entirely for a while, and she started slowly, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, telling people the truth about where she came from instead of the softened version she'd practiced for months. She works alongside me 2 days a week now, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, learning the trade her grandmother's hands never touched but her own clearly love, and the last time a client asked her, skeptically, whether a piece I'd flagged as valuable was really worth what I'd said. For scraps of love, I heard my daughter answer without hesitation in words I recognized instantly as my own. My mother's been doing this 41 years. Value's what it sells for. Worth is what it costs somebody to make. For scraps of love, she's never once gotten those two confused, and I wouldn't bet against her. I keep Walter's cedar box on my kitchen table still, its false bottom empty now, its work long finished. It's of begging for scraps of love, its lid worn smooth in the exact place where 9 words are carved too small for anyone but me to read without a loop. I've built you plenty, this is the last one, keep it close. I understand now, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, in a way I didn't 3 years ago, that he wasn't only talking about a deed. He was talking about the part of me that had spent a lifetime letting people decide, on a 4-second glance, exactly what I was worth. For scraps of love, that part I finally understood 11 days after a trash can and 19 days before a wedding was never actually lost either. It had simply been waiting quietly for me to open it myself. Years of begging for scraps of love. If any part of this story found you where you're sitting right now, if you've ever been handed a bill in one hand and shown the door with the other, I want you to hear this clearly. Of begging for scraps of love. Your generosity was never a tax someone else gets to collect. Keep your dignity and your giving in the same 2 hands. They cost exactly the same to build, and nobody, however loudly they insist otherwise, 10 years of begging for scraps of love ever gets to decide their price but you. That's my story. 1 box in a trash can, 1 lawyer on the phone, and $48,000 that stayed exactly where it belonged. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. If it reminded you what you're actually worth, tell me in the comments and I'll see you in the next one.